like to understand a little bit better, if possible, what does it mean for Boko Haram to be alive with the Islamic State? Has anything changed since the group pledged alliance to ISIS last year?
Of course, a lot have changed. You have heard on the news the change of leadership, and Shekau denying that change of leadership. But for me, people talk about having a link. Islamic groups around the world, they talk about having a link. So it is important as scholars for us to define what is a link. Is it a physical link? Is it ideological link? Is it inspirational? Is it possible that I can sit on Skype and learn something from a terrorist in Malaysia without actually meeting him face to face? In Nigeria, we do not practice monarchy as such, the way we see in Saudi Arabia, right? But when you listen to most of the YouTube videos and even the writing of Yusuf Adi Akidatuna, this is a book that he translated, we translated from Arabic and Hausa into English. They really copy a lot of the Islamic writers from Saudi Arabia. Why? Because in Saudi Arabia, they practice monarchy. And because they practice monarchy, most of the writers in Saudi Arabia do not glorify democracy. In fact, they condemn the values of democracy. So when people like Yusuf and Shekau come across books and literature from Saudi Arabia, they simply transport these things into Nigeria, where we practice democracy. And so they denounce, using those books and literature, they denounce the values, absolutely the values, of democracy, promoting this theocratic nature of a state. So I think that at the moment, as we listen on the news, the structures have changed, the leadership has changed, but I think that these ideological links are still there, these inspirational links are still there, and I think these are very important things. For me, I don't want us to limit it to the fact that Islamic State must physically deliver weapons to Boko Haram before we know that there is a link. The ideological link is very important. That you can sit in your room and be inspired by someone you know. I never met Pope Francis, but I really like the way the guy talks. You understand? So I don't need to meet him physically for him to inspire me. So, and I think that this is really an important point we should take into consideration.
Thank you.
Some of this is focused on locals and the insurgency, or military and insurgents, and I'd be interested to get both your views on local population and the Nigerian military. Now, if both sides are accused of conducting atrocities, but the military is seen as corrupt, whereas Boko Haram styles itself on being incorruptible, what role, if any, does corruption in the Nigerian military play in undermining the military in the eyes of locals or reinforcing Boko Haram's message?
Thank you. Hilary, why don't you go first?
Sure. So that's a really great point, and that's, in my opinion, the abuses of the military was one of the forces that allowed Boko Haram to metastasize into the crisis that it's become. When I was in my degree, one of the most telling exchanges that I had was with a civilian who had not participated in any of the vigilante groups, but many of his friends had. And so I asked him to describe, when the military first came to town, what was that relationship? What was it like? And he said, we were like Tom and Jerry, the cartoons. And he said, it's better now, but because the military had been so bad, it forced the populations to really place a lot of trust in the Civilian Joint Task Force and a lot of these vigilante groups that popped up, which is understandable, certainly as a recourse to just maintain your physical safety, but has created just a host of issues. There's a really interesting literature coming out now on the effects of pro-government militias on human rights abuses, the effects of pro-government militias on actually increasing civilian targeting by insurgents, and I think that both of those have played out in northeastern Nigeria, where Borno State alone has, I think it's 26,000 registered members of the Civilian Joint Task Force, and there's no real accountability mechanisms for them. And so the local population's mistrust of the military has now created, in my opinion, what is kind of a simmering crisis, which is once Boko Haram is put down and that crisis comes to an end, what do you do with the 26,000 members of the Civilian Joint Task Force in Borno? And right now, a number of politicians, civil society leaders in Borno are struggling to come up with an idea, and some are saying we should absorb them into the army, but that's an institution that's already struggling to pay its salaries on time. Same with the police force, and frankly, a number of the members of the CJTF don't have the training to be incorporated into the civil society. So I'm not sure if that addresses your point directly, but I think the issue of pro-government militias and the vigilantes in the Northeast is certainly worth raising and keeping on kind of all Africa Watchers' radar for a while. That's right.
Yeah. One of my PhD chapters is on how the deployment of military force indirectly aided the transformation of Boko Haram. So you can wait for that book. I just have to make one comment. The problem within the security institution in Nigeria predates Boko Haram. And let's be clear about that. But I must pay tribute to the individual soldiers who have really sacrificed their lives trying to defend that country. And I think it's important that we recognize that. When I started my research, I visited over 25 military barracks, including police barracks, to look at the living conditions of our soldiers and policemen, even before their deployment. Just go to the barracks in Abuja, just behind the presidential villa. It's called the Mambila Barracks. Single rooms that were actually meant for unmarried soldiers now contain a family probably of 8. Already a soldier in that kind of condition, you ask him to go and stand by the roadside to provide security. He's already thinking of how to get some money to build a land, to move his family outside the barracks to live there. So already in him there's that grievance against the state, against security institution, against his own bosses. So even if he's fighting, he's probably fighting to keep his job. So there are all different levels of corruption. And even when the JTF was put together, it was a kind of interagency kind of a collaboration within the security institution, where the customs, the police, the military, they were all brought together. And if you read what they call the Galtimari report, you will discover in that report that even though the agencies were acting as a security institution, as one body, all of them, the police, the military, the soldiers, they are all running independent budgets. They had to quarrel over the budget. Who should supply these weapons? Who should supply that? And there was a bit of struggle as to who should have access to the president. When should our own budget be approved? And so the concern was eventually about having access to the president, fighting for your own budget to be approved, trying to acquire arms rather than fighting Boko Haram. So, and I think that became a problem. And because of long years of lack of reform within the military institution, our soldiers were not even sent probably on further studies, on learning the new tactics on guerrilla war, terrorism, and the emerging cyber kind of terrorism that is happening. All that eventually, affected the security institution. And I think that it's almost with most institutions, within Nigeria. So these are some of the things, but if you want to read more, when my book is out.
So, I to follow up, you talked about the detainee abuse situation, and that was kind of the nature of my question, the role of the Nigerian state. I'm very concerned, with sort of the primacy of the Nigerian state in managing the de-radicalization and safe corridor process. I was actually, again, we've all come back from northeastern Nigeria recently. I saw the facility in Gombe where these boys are held, and it's a prison, and the locals are very worried about these young men escaping. But as we know, a lot of the men detained by the Nigerian army accused of Boko Haram, many of them don't have any connections because of the sort of very indiscriminate nature of the roundups. But I'm also really worried about the primacy of the Nigerian state in this sort of humanitarian process as well. And I know both of you have sort of, Atta, you've seen prisons up close, so you've seen that sort of detainee issue. Hilary, you've seen IDP camps up close. You've sort of seen how the Nigerian state has sort of inserted itself as a middleman in this process, and how over the past 2 years, in the case of the humanitarian crisis, or the past several years in the case of the security operations, how individuals have come to sort of become predatory. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of the predatory nature of the Nigerian state, especially when it comes to women and girls in the IDP camps, and then also what you've seen in prisons as well.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for raising that point. It was actually one of the more disturbing things that I saw during my time in the Northeast. And so, under international humanitarian law, the state has the right to organize the centers for the displaced within its borders. And that usually falls under the purview of an emergency management agency. And Nigeria has, at the state, at the national, and at the local government level, all of these different emergency management agencies that on paper are often tasked with caring for these IDPs. And it's worth noting that the scale of displacement in the Lake Chad Basin is just mind-boggling. I read yesterday that it's something like 1 in every 7 residents of the Lake Chad Basin is now displaced. And a huge proportion of those are now in Maiduguri. So it's the concentration of the displaced is mind-boggling. And at these camps, despite the fact that it's ostensibly managed by NEMA, SEMA, and the local government emergency management agencies in partnership with NGOs of both Nigeria and international origin, it's the military, the police, and the local vigilantes that actually manage the gates and determine what goes in and what goes out. And so even though I was with UNICEF with a signed letter from the State Emergency Management Agency's coordinator signed that day listing that camp, I was turned away at the gate until I could go to the military barracks and get approval from that leadership. And so, de facto, the security sector is running the humanitarian sector, and that raises a number of issues. One, in my opinion, I think it turns displacement centers into an even greater target because you have an insurgency that is wildly anti-state. And we've seen a few attempted attacks on IDP camps already with female suicide bombers. So the security issue is there. Secondly, it places women at such an increased rate of vulnerability. And so we're getting all of these reports of survival sex and of, essentially IDP guards restricting the movements of women and then forcing them into sexual favors and then physically harassing them if they refuse. And so I was speaking to a number of girls in the Delori 2 camp, and I would say, if you wanted to leave, could you? And they couldn't leave. And I said, what happened if you try? And this one girl was heartbreaking. She's from Cameroon. She said, I was trying to leave to go home. I wanted to see my mother. And when I tried to leave, the soldier beat me. And so we really run a risk of IDP camps also turning into internment camps. Another point, because the abuse there is so tangible and on the ground in the area, frankly, so well known, the vast majority of the displaced do not live in official camps. They live in informal settlements or with extended kin networks. And I was speaking to a number of women who live on the grounds of Medina Mosque in Maiduguri, where they receive very limited official support because it's not an official camp. And I said, why would you not go to these IDP camps where, you're guaranteed at least 1 meal a day on paper, according to the state, it's 2, but you'd have access to more medical care, better shelters. And women said, we've heard that the abuse there is too bad. I would rather live on my own here and beg from dawn until dusk than go live in that situation. So the abuses are rampant, and I think, the international community turning a blind eye to that is a shame on all of our conscience.
Yeah, just briefly, I'm also very concerned, like yourself. I don't know, that's nothing I can do, because at the end of the day, the Nigerian government has taken a lot upon itself. The level of privatization you see here in the West doesn't happen in Nigeria, for example. The government virtually handles everything, from provision of tap water to road to hospitals, virtually everything, including the radicalization, program. And then secondly, just to let you know the predatory nature of the whole thing, suddenly now everyone in Nigeria is a prevent expert. It's a counterterrorism expert. And then people are submitting all kinds of proposals, even when they don't know anything about terrorism. They all want, so the whole conflict has created an independent economy where different layers of people, from lawyers to politicians to preachers, everyone wants to take something out of it. And that is why eventually you find relief materials disappearing. That's why you see even IDPs refusing to go to government-recognized camps. They prefer to go and stay with their relatives because they just cannot trust anyone. So I don't know what I can do. Maybe to invite God to come down himself. I just don't know.
You mentioned that initially a lot of the funding was from donations, etc. That's pre-2009. It'd be very interesting if you could provide any insight on finance and funding for Boko Haram post-2009. And the second is for Hilary with regards to the IDP camps. I think it's just utterly shameful, the lack of support and the lack of publicity they've received. Just out of curiosity, do you see amongst any of the women, in particular, they're all young women, display any sense of anger or resentment at the fact that the Chibok girls are sort of seen as sort of prize? And I remember there was a time on Twitter and they had said, oh, they had freed some hostages and everyone got excited. Is it Chibok girls? Oh no, it's not Chibok girls, and I'm somewhat disappointed in a way. But what were your experiences with regards to that there?
Do you want to go first?
Okay. I mean, that's a historical precedence, where you always have this relationship between political parties and Islamic sects. I don't think it's new. My elders are here. They know a lot about the history of Nigeria. The Northern Elements Progressive Union, for example, in those days around the 60s, was supported by the Tijaniya. The Qadariya supported Ahmadu Bello's own party, So there's that historical precedent. And so when Boko Haram eventually emerged around Yobe and Maiduguri, it was normal that they will have that kind of relationship with politicians. When they established the Kanama camp, it's a territory, it's within a place. Who gave them the camp? Who approved the land? Don't we have government structures if people want to acquire a land? When Muhammad Yusuf constructed the Ibn Taymiyyah Masjid, who approved the land? Who gave him the building permission? So it is because there are networks, and this level of donations, some people did it out of simplicity. We are donating to a religious group. God will reward us at the end of the day. And so even when we went to the prison and we got engaged with these guys, we try to classify them. Some of them as funders, others as providing. In fact, one of them was heading an Al-Majri school when he was arrested. And he virtually was supplying Boko Haram with students from his Al-Majri school, for example. So people were not only donating cash, right? They were donating students. I don't know how true this story is about a man who donated 3 of his daughters. So it is not just about cash or financial donation, so much so that anything that could help, people were ready to make that donation. But as I said, we always have to make the distinction how appealing it was before 2009 and after 2009. Because presumably after 2009, a lot of people wouldn't like to be identified with the atrocities of Boko Haram. Probably if they were killing politicians rather than innocent civilians, maybe some people would love to be identified. I don't know.
Yeah, and just quickly, that's a really interesting point that you raise. And most of the women that I spoke to were aware of the Chibok girls, but not particularly concerned by them. And a lot of the displaced just aren't quite as active on social media as I think everyone in this room is. But there was a really interesting divide between sort of the more affluent civil society members who did raise that issue of frustration that it often just boiled down to what happened to the Chibok girls, to the point that even those who followed the story of the first Chibok girl that was rescued in Keke a few months back, she was rescued with her husband, and calling it a rescue is kind of interesting because they just escaped together and then contacted the military and said, hi, we're gone from Boko Haram now. Well, what's next? But there's no real follow-on story about what happened to her husband, right? And she came out with an interview that said, I miss my husband, but people ignore that. And so I think there is a certain level of frustration amongst a number of the NGO workers and certainly international advocates that the focus has become so all-encompassing that the narrative itself has been distorted to a really unhelpful degree.
But I wanted to come back to the question that's kind of the focus of the event, which is about listening. And who can listen to Boko Haram? Who can listen? Because one of the problems I have as somebody who's not a Nigerian is, how do I listen? Hilary, you mentioned, people bring their own perceptions to this debate, and particularly around gender, where issues of gender equality are often associated with stability and with non-violence, and that's not always the case. And where also there are dominant narratives which are very easily fed into. For a while there was no shortage of journalists going to IDP camps and coming out with stories which fed into particular lines. So I'd just like to go to that really fundamental question of how do we listen, who can listen, and what do we need to think about when we are trying to listen?
Thank you.
Wow. I mean, for me, my opinion is very, very simple. I want to go against the narrative that Boko Haram is simply faceless. If you are going to do that, you really have to indicate the time frame. These guys were not faceless at the very beginning, before 2009. They were preaching freely in Maiduguri. They were having debates in Bauchi and Gombe. In fact, when I visited Bauchi in one of the markets, they call it Kaswangwaza, there was a studio where some of the things were recorded. And in fact, before 2009, most of the videos were readily available. On YouTube, the audio cassettes were literally sold on local markets. So I think that as journalists, as scholars who go into Nigeria and you want to get to a problem, you look for the very source, rather than probably just picking up people's prejudices and opinions and reporting on them. So I think that as a scholar, I shouldn't be the one instructing you who to listen to, where to go to. You just have to, even as a Westerner, because at the end of the day, when you leave London and you go into Nigeria, probably if I go into Nigeria with you, trust me, you are going to have easy access to Atiku Abubakar than me. I have to press a lot of buttons. But because you are coming from the UK, from King's College, London, people will like, wow, just open the door for her to go in. But for me, I may even have to bribe the security man at his gate to have access to Atiku, So I think in that case, we really, if we want to deal with this type of problems, we really have to. I strongly believe that despite the atrocities of Boko Haram, they really have something to say, if we can listen to them. Because they talk about one of them, when I met him in prison, he was talking about the convoy of the Gombe state governor. A convoy of more than 25 cars. Most of these cars are empty, but all of them have policemen. They have to be fed, the accommodation must be given, all the cars must be fueled. Now, you may think this is a madman talking, right? Somebody who is not mentally okay. But I think that he's saying something very serious here, that there's a lot of waste, financial waste, and in trying to maintain the democratic political system in Nigeria, there's really a lot of waste. And if we can listen to this type of people, I think in how to counter them will be very, very easy, rather than being loaded with prejudice and sentiments and then writing about it. So that's why listening is important.